Clinical ADHD, severe circadian fatigue, and localized cortical lesions share an unexpected correlation. They often coincide with superior performance in specific creative domains. We usually assume high-level creativity is a product of peak brain performance, specifically advanced and unified prefrontal executive functioning. But these anomalous states all share a specific physiological deficit. They feature a compromised capacity to exert inhibitory control. Under normal conditions, inhibitory control acts as a strict executive filter. It suppresses irrelevant stimuli to keep working memory focused on the immediate goal. The data suggests that the creative spikes seen in these anomalous states result from the failure of this inhibitory filter. To prove this, we have to examine how systematically exhausting cognitive inhibition alters the physical spread of semantic networks in the brain. For certain types of divergent thinking, a failing executive filter is not a biological bug. It is a mandatory functional requirement. Relying on observational studies of clinical populations introduces too many variables. To test this hypothesis accurately, we have to induce a controlled state of cognitive depletion in healthy subjects. This relies on the mechanism of ego depletion. Executive functions, particularly inhibitory control, draw on limited cognitive resources that can be temporarily exhausted through intense, continuous use. This flowchart details the protocol. Researchers measured baseline cognitive performance, then subjected participants to a 40-minute depletion phase using conflict resolution tests. The high-demand group faced 50% incompatible trials, forcing their brains to constantly suppress incorrect automatic responses. This chart visualizes the validation data. Comparing pre-test and post-test accuracy, we see a measurable drop in performance exclusively in the group subjected to the high inhibition demand condition. Crucially, this drop in accuracy was not linked to general exhaustion. Both the high demand and control groups reported identical levels of physical fatigue and motivation. The researchers successfully bypassed general fatigue, creating a precise exhaustion of the exact cognitive network responsible for filtering irrelevant data. With their inhibitory resources depleted, participants were tested in two distinct creative environments. First was the alternate uses task, a divergent thinking task that requires open-ended, unfiltered ideational generation. Second was the remote associates task, a convergent thinking task. This requires participants to satisfy strict constraints to find a singular correct solution to a word puzzle. Looking at the post-depletion results, a stark behavioral dissociation emerges. With exhausted inhibitory resources, participants produced significant spikes in the volume and originality of generated ideas. Conversely, performance on convergent word puzzles flatlined, showing zero change in solving rates. Finding a single correct solution requires heavy executive processing. You need strong inhibitory control to prevent semantically adjacent, but ultimately incorrect ideas from crowding working memory. But when the goal is to generate multiple unique concepts, those strict constraints become a liability. Removing the cognitive filter allows a broad range of previously suppressed information to surface. The data indicates that cognitive depletion increases divergent ideational combinations, while offering zero benefit to strictly convergent problem-solving tasks. This behavioral split reveals exactly what happens, but we have to look at the underlying cognitive architecture to understand how exhaustion physically alters associative networks in the brain. To measure this, researchers used a primed lexical decision task. This tool tracks the automatic, non-conscious spreading of semantic activation by measuring how quickly a participant recognizes a word after seeing a prime. The test distinguishes between closely related primes, like piano and violin, versus distantly, indirectly related primes. This bar graph shows semantic priming effects in milliseconds. For directly related primes on the left, both the high and low demand groups performed identically. But for indirect primes on the right, the high demand group exhibits a pronounced hyperpriming effect. When the inhibitory filter is exhausted, the associative gradient flattens. A single concept sends a ripple outward, activating distant nodes that are normally suppressed. This flattened associative gradient is the raw mechanical engine of original ideation. It physically allows distantly related concepts to breach working memory simultaneously. Cognitive neuroscience has long struggled with wildly inconsistent activation patterns of the prefrontal cortex during creativity studies. Recognizing the dual nature of creativity tasks, divergent versus convergent, perfectly resolves this neuroimaging inconsistency. This model compares two cognitive states. High executive control relies on lateral frontal activity to create a tightly filtered linear network, optimized for strict problem solving. The second is a depleted control state. Here, the network is sprawling and messy, optimized for divergent generation. When neuroimaging reveals lateral frontal deactivation during creative tasks, it should not be interpreted as a lack of focus or a failure of effort. Instead, this deactivation is an active, necessary release of inhibitory mechanisms. The brain is deliberately lowering its cognitive shields. High executive control actively suppresses the noisy, distant associative connections required for ideational generation. This dual model offers a practical framework for cognitive professionals and knowledge workers. Tasks like coding, data validation, or logical deduction are convergent. They require protection of executive resources and high levels of inhibitory control. But divergent tasks, like initial brainstorming or lateral strategy formulation, demand the opposite. They require deliberate states of disinhibition. Working at a non-optimal time of day or tackling a problem following a heavy cognitive load can be strategically leveraged to force this divergent thinking. The data rejects the idea that the brain has a single optimal operating state for intellectual work. Elite creative output requires orchestrating deliberate shifts between strict constraint satisfaction and uninhibited semantic spreading. Generating original ideas depends on occasionally engineering the deliberate failure of your highest cognitive filters.